There are three main types of perspective: 1-point perspective, 2-point perspective, and 3-point perspective. It's important to recognize each so that I can make informed decisions about my composition and know what type of guide structure is needed to create my drawing. It's funny, whenever it's suggested there are multiple types of perspective, my mind starts filling in a scorecard to determine which type of perspective will look best. Does a 2-point perspective drawing look better than a 1-point perspective drawing? Is it a better demonstration of skill to draw in 3-point perspective? Or is it the other way around? It seems like it's mandatory that I show a depiction of railroad tracks in any serious discussion of perspective. I don't know of any other imagery that's become so iconic with perspective drawing. The reason is, railroad tracks beautifully illustrate how parallel lines converge to a vanishing point, as seen here. In fact, all lines that are not perpendicular to the viewer will converge to a vanishing point. There is a slight caveat. Sometimes there are multiple vanishing points, as I will describe later on. To identify 1, 2, or 3-point perspective, it's crucial to note perspective is based on the viewer's orientation with objects in a scene rather than a style of drawing. Here's the clock tower, this time in 1-point perspective. How do I know it's drawn in 1-point perspective, besides the fact that I'm the one who drew it that way? The first indication I'm viewing the clock tower in 1-point perspective, the vertical lines are perfectly vertical or plumb. This occurs when the viewer's direction of view is parallel to the horizon. The viewer's direction of view is also parallel to the ground plane, which is obvious in a drawing like this one where the clock tower is set in the middle of some kind of infinite void. The second indication, the horizontal lines are perfectly horizontal. This occurs when the viewer's orientation with an object is identical to the object's orientation in space. The clock tower's square edges make it easy to see that the viewer is facing it directly. Ignoring the clock tower's roof and slanted supports at its base, all the lines that are perpendicular to the viewer appear either perfectly vertical or horizontal. The remaining lines, the ones parallel to the viewer and receding in depth, are all angled toward the central viewpoint. In this illustration, any sense of depth comes from the lines running parallel to the viewer's direction of view. My clock tower drawing doesn't demonstrate a sense of depth as effectively as this illustration does. The reflection pool, the walkways, and the rows of trees convey a sense of depth rather dramatically in this example of 1-point perspective. This works in photos too. The photographer has taken advantage of the walkway, its tiling, the benches, the columns, and archways to create another dramatic example of 1-point perspective. Moving on to 2-point perspective. This illustration has the same clock tower, but now it's viewed from an angle rather than straight on. I can now see two sides of the clock tower, but this is not what defines 2-point perspective from 1-point perspective. 2-point perspective still features the same vertical lines as 1-point perspective, but the horizontal lines are all angled. Each side of the clock tower recedes to its own vanishing point. I can see the vanishing point on the left, but the one on the right falls outside my view. This drawing contains a central vanishing point, just like a 1-point perspective drawing does. But since the tower's orientation to the viewer has changed, the receding parallel lines are no longer parallel to the viewer. Now they need to recede to their own vanishing points. Notice that all the vanishing points are located on the horizon line. Also notice how angles get shallower as they approach the horizon line. If vandals were to spray paint a green line on the clock tower at exactly the viewer's eye line, it would appear flat. Here's an interesting photo of a prefabricated building in 2-point perspective. It's obvious the photographer took great care in composing this shot because the vertical lines are perfectly vertical, as they should be using 2-point perspective. This photo shows what often happens in snapshots. The vertical lines are slanting in unappealing angles when the photographer doesn't concentrate on keeping the camera pointed level. It's often the goal of architectural photographers to make sure all vertical lines appear as vertical as possible. Fortunately, this is much easier to control when drawing 2-point perspective. Using 3-point perspective gives the clock tower a somewhat different character, almost like it's looming over me. It wouldn't be hard to imagine my clock tower as a rocket ship. If it were, it might instead appear regal and proud from this point of view. In 3-point perspective, there are no perfectly vertical or horizontal lines remaining. The vertical lines of the clock tower are now converging to some point in space above it. All lines converge to some vanishing point. The viewer is no longer parallel or perpendicular to any lines on the clock tower. Three-point perspective is usually the result of the viewer either looking up or looking down on a scene. When looking down, the vertical lines converge to a point somewhere below the clock tower. The image plane is always perpendicular to the viewer, so when the viewer looks up or down, the image plane rotates accordingly and is no longer perpendicular to the scene. Since all parallel lines not perpendicular to the viewer must terminate at some distant vanishing point, this creates the need for a third vanishing point. Here's a common example of three-point perspective. This photo also has a tilted horizon line, something that could be fun to incorporate into a perspective drawing. Using my cube prop, I'm going to carefully position it so it's directly facing the viewer. This is being seen in one-point perspective. My vertical lines are vertical and my horizontal lines are horizontal. Now, if I carefully rotate it either left or right, the cube is now being seen in two-point perspective. The edges on this side are converging to their own vanishing point, and the edges on the opposite side are converging to their own vanishing point. Now, the vertical edges are still vertical, hopefully, depending on how well I'm performing as a prop master. But if I tilt the cube intentionally forward, these vertical edges all are now converging to a new vanishing point. These edges still are converging to a vanishing point, and these edges are as well. This cube is now being seen in three-point perspective by the viewer. So, does this mean a scene can contain 1, 2, and 3-point perspective? Yes. It's the way the world presents itself to me every day. The type of perspective I see is entirely dependent on my orientation to the objects I see before me. So, does this mean I need to always use three-point perspective to get realistic drawings? Not necessarily. Remember, in this photo, all of the objects are oriented in one-point perspective to the viewer. I would encourage observation of the world around us to begin noticing, no matter how complex the object, it can be viewed from 1, 2, or 3-point perspective. Enough lecturing. In the next class, I will demonstrate how to draw a basic cube in one-point perspective with and without the COV rig, a perspective tool that you won't want to live without.